Hey everybody, it's Barbara Ann. Welcome back to my channel, Straight Out of Context. I'm so happy that you're here. Today we're going to deep dive the birth, the life, the career, and the unfortunate passing of Elvis Aaron Presley. If you're interested, stick around and watch. I'm so glad you joined me today. A king is born. Born on January 8th of 1935 in East Tupelo, Mississippi, Jesse Garon Presley comes into the world in his parents' impoverished, tiny two-bedroom shack, of which his father, grandfather, and uncle had built for the family. Gladys and Vernon Presley were devastated. Jesse had been born a stillborn. The physician that was attending the birth quickly realized there was a second baby in utero, and 35 minutes later, Elvis Aaron Presley was born into the world, thriving and very much alive. Elvis was now an identical twin without his twin. Jesse Garon Presley and Elvis Aaron Presley were names that were chosen by their father, Vernon, because they rhyme. Gladys and Vernon Presley were absolutely devastated at the loss of their infant identical twin son. They were so impoverished that they couldn't afford a coffin or a burial plot, so they decided to bury Jesse in a very nice shoebox instead, tied with lace and red ribbon. Jesse Garon Presley was buried in an unmarked grave in Priceville Memorial Gardens in Tupelo, Mississippi, next to his great aunt Susan Presley and Noah Presley. Despite there being a memorial marker for Jesse at Graceland in the Memorial Garden to honor Jesse, his actual body is in that unmarked grave to this day because it was too fragile to move to Graceland. There are many conspiracy theories in the world that Jesse had actually lived and that the family hid him from view because he would later become a stunt double and body double for his identical twin brother Elvis. However, that is nothing but conspiracy theories. Elvis very much grew up a lost twin and an only child as well. I worked very hard on this to give my viewers a very realistic visual of what it may have looked like for the Presley family had Jesse survived. So I give you this rendition that I made. This is Jesse, Elvis, Gladys, and Vernon had Jesse lived. Elvis would later say in life that he always felt a connection to his lost identical twin brother, and he would spend the rest of his life feeling immense pressure and guilt to live a full, beautiful, complete life because his twin didn't get to survive with him. Gladys and Vernon would actually say for the rest of Elvis's life that they believed Jesse's spirit went into Elvis's body at birth. And therefore, Elvis was so talented and special because Jesse became intertwined with his spirit. This is the beginning of Elvis and his mother Gladys having a very tight, close-knit bond that would last until her passing. This made Gladys cling to Elvis and protect him even more so, and this made Elvis in turn indebted to his mother to be a good, loving, devout son to her. Although the world will never know what could have been, we can still speculate. Were there two kings born that day? Would they have gone on to equally be as talented musically and be the dynamic duo, the Presley twins? Or would environment and choice have taken their lives in a different, very drastically unique turn? And neither of them become famous. What if Jesse was the one to have all the talent and have became famous? We'll never know. What we do know for a fact is that Jesse Garon Presley is in an unmarked grave near Susan Presley and Noah Presley, still to this day. And the marker for Jesse still remains at Graceland in the Memorial Garden to honor his life. There with his identical twin brother, both of his parents, and his grandmother, Minnie May. Elvis grew up a very quiet, timid, and shy young boy who was often cited as a, quote, mama's boy, unquote. And at the age of 10, he came in 5th place with his first ever performance at a fair in Tupelo, Mississippi, where he sang Old Shep. However, he remembers the day ending with a whipping from his mama for his misbehaving. Now, Elvis's teachers throughout the years would often say that he was unremarkable as far as grades, but as far as his behavior went, he was often very quiet, shy, and he would listen well. Now, this made him unpopular among his peers, where he was called names like a teacher's pet and made fun of because he didn't have nice clothes or nice shoes. That's all right. When Elvis was only 2.5 years old, his father Vernon was arrested and indicted on forgery charges, and he later would plead guilty to those charges. He was sentenced to 3 years in Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. However, he was released from prison in February of 1939 with a 6-month suspension of his sentence. This is when Elvis and his mother Gladys became even closer because she was left to fend for her and Elvis all on her own during that time, often taking odd jobs and washing people's clothes to make ends meet and put food on the table for her and Elvis. Gladys and Elvis shared a deeply affectionate, loving, close bond. She was fiercely protective of her only surviving identical twin son. She was called the, quote, love of his life, unquote. She was a mama bear who protected him at all costs. In the early 1950s, Gladys started turning to alcohol. As Elvis's fame grew, Gladys struggled to cope with the spotlight, the millions of adoring young fans, and the separation from her only child. This contributed to her declining health. Gladys and Elvis both believed they shared a psychic connection and that his deceased identical twin brother Jesse was also a part of Elvis, sharing that connection. Elvis and Gladys slept in the same bed until he was a teenager, and they even shared a language that nobody else could understand. People often said that it was like baby talk, like goo goo gaga. August 14th of 1958, Gladys Presley passes away from chronic liver disease and acute hepatitis when Elvis was stationed in the military. This devastating loss would have a lasting impact on him, significantly altering his personality. This was a change that was not a positive and proactive one. Not only did Elvis grieve his mother for the rest of his life, he was lost without his mother. This grief contributed to his declining health and his misuse of prescription medications in abundance. Gladys often gave her son advice on what to do, how to do it, what was best for him, how to behave, how to eat, what to wear. And without her in his life, he felt utterly out of control. But what they didn't know is that Gladys's parents, genetically had congenital heart disease, which genetically can be passed down and was in the Presley family through Gladys to Elvis. In the ghetto. When Elvis was 13 years old, the family relocated from Tupelo, Mississippi to Memphis, Tennessee. They moved into a government project building called Lauderdale Courts. Elvis attended Hume's Preparatory Academy Middle School. He would then go on to Hume's High School in Memphis, Tennessee. 3 years earlier, when Elvis was only 10 years old, he was given a guitar as a gift. But in Memphis, Tennessee is where he practiced the guitar with a neighbor named Lee Denson, whom was a few years his senior. Elvis graduated Hume's High School on June 3rd of 1953 when he was 18 years old. Elvis failed music class all throughout school, and he never learned how to read or write music. He largely played by ear. He attended the Pentecostal church and sang in the group at Reverend H.W. Brewster's Black Memphis Church. This is where everybody realized that Elvis Presley had a vocal talent, and a rare, gifted vocal talent. Stage fright, anxiety, and nerves would follow Elvis with performances for the rest of his life. But he did perform at Hume's High School annual minstrel show in 1953, where everybody would then realize how vocally talented Elvis truly was. Growing up poor and living in 6 different ghetto government projects in his time in Memphis before his career took off afforded Elvis something that most young Caucasian men didn't get at that time. It afforded him, in a racially segregated Deep South, a very unique thing: exposure to African American gospel music, blues, country, and rock and roll, which were all African American genres of music. Elvis would state for the rest of his life that his earliest influences were Big Mama Thornton, Fats Domino, Jimmy Jones, and B.B. King, of whom he personally knew, because when he was a teenager, he would frequent downtown Memphis, Tennessee, on Beale Street, where B.B. King was also frequenting, and that is how the two came to meet. I got lucky. The Memphis Blues originated in the 1950s on Beale Street, Memphis, Tennessee. Beale Street was a hub for African American blues music and a destination for aspiring musicians. B.B. King was not only one of the biggest Memphis musicians, but renowned worldwide as the greatest blues musician to ever perform. He burst onto the scene in the late 1940s. His imprint is evident today in museum displays, nightclubs, and even a street which is named in his honor. Growing up poor and in largely African American neighborhoods, Elvis frequented Beale Street and became friends with B.B. King, who would later go on to say that he liked Elvis and considered him a fellow Mississippian. He was impressed by his sincerity and that he had a kinship with Elvis. King also said that Elvis Presley had the looks, the talent, and the rhythm. He and Elvis Presley would talk about music and how it transcended race. B.B. King would also play Lucille Elvis's guitar and sing with him in his suite after he would play sets. It's stated today that Elvis Presley was never sued by any black artists because he never stole from anyone. Producers and songwriters always got credits and paid, and it is widely known that Otis Blackwell is one of Elvis's largest songwriters, giving him his biggest hits, like Don't Be Cruel, All Shook Up, Return to Sender, Great Balls of Fire, Fever, and Breathless. Otis Blackwell was a Brooklyn-born songwriter, but Tom Parker, who would later become Elvis's manager, forced him to give a co-writing credit to Elvis when he didn't co-write any songs in his entire career, but this also gave him royalties on them. When asked about Elvis appropriating black culture and music, B.B. King stated, "I don't think that he ripped him off," he said. "I think once something has been exposed, anyone can add or take from it if they like. He was just so great, so popular, and so hot. And so anything he played became a hit. To me, they didn't make a mistake when they called him the king." A rumor had swirled for many years that Elvis said, quote, "The only thing in words can do for me is buy my records and shine my shoes," unquote. In 1957 interview with Jet magazine, Elvis was the first to deny this and give credit where credit was due to the black community and black musicians. Jet magazine was unable to verify or corroborate that rumor was true because Elvis had never said it. Even nearly 5 decades after his passing, this rumor still comes about. Elvis felt an affinity to the black community because he grew up in black neighborhoods in his hometown of Tupelo, Mississippi. As a white Southern boy, he did not see color. Because they were poor, the Presleys lived in the same kind of life as any poor black family did. Poor people in the South, both black and white, shared common heritage that was stamped on them by outsiders. The two groups shared similar living conditions, effects of poverty, endurance of scorn, and pursuit of relief. Still, even almost 50 years after his death, Elvis Presley's estate still largely employs African Americans, as he did during his entire life and career. Over 91% of all associates working the Graceland Tourist Complex are African American. In 1954, Elvis Presley auditioned for Sam Phillips, a producer at Sun Records. He recorded a demo of My Happiness, and That's When Your Heartache Begins, for his mother Gladys. In the same year of 1954, this is where Elvis Presley's career began professionally, when he signed with Sun Records. Sun Records producer Sam Phillips wanted to bring the sound of African American underground Memphis music to a wider white mainstream audience, specifically targeting America's white youth. Elvis just happened to have the voice, the looks, and the dance moves. January 1956, he was wildly famous for Heartbreak Hotel when it was released, and he quickly became a star. He was considered a threat to the moral well-being of white American youth. He was everywhere and never without adoring, screaming female fans swarming him everywhere he went. In 1956, Elvis appeared on KSLA TV broadcasts of the Louisiana Hayride. He gained national attention the same year on Ed Sullivan's show, performing Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, Ready Teddy, and Hound Dog, where they could only show Elvis from the chest up because they were afraid his moves were too risque for television. With his wild hip thrusts, leg shakes, swaying, the way that he treated his guitar, piano, and mic stand as both a phallus and a girl, Elvis was dubbed quote, Elvis the pelvis, unquote. He was considered a sexual pioneer, but today that's heavily debated. This is where Tom Parker, aka Colonel Parker, a Dutch entrepreneur and music manager, decided to take on Elvis as his manager. And this relationship would last until Elvis passes away, August 16th of 1977. 1956 was a very busy year for Elvis. Not only was he an enormous star in America already, he appeared at the Goodwill Review also. His manager, Colonel Parker, was instrumental in cementing his film deals, his appearances, interviews, albums, and even merchandise such as buttons and flyers, which were much like today's posters. Colonel Parker had a 24-plus year relationship professionally with Elvis Presley. This is a relationship that is often speculated about since he took 50% of all of Elvis Presley's earnings, working him to the bone. It's often said this is how Elvis started with his misuse of prescription medications because of being overworked by Colonel Parker. Between 1956 and 1969, Elvis filmed 31 feature films. That's 31 full movies and 2 concert documentary films. He also released 57 full-length albums. All the way through 1957, Elvis Presley had a phenomenal start to his career. Not only was he immensely popular, but he was working every day, all day. He was everywhere, all the time. 1957 was also instrumental in Elvis's life because March 27th of that year, this is when he would go on to purchase Graceland and the 14 acres it was on. It was originally a part of a cattle farm. Graceland House was designed and built by a doctor and his wife. Elvis then purchases the home from the doctor for $102,500. Like any Southern boy who comes up from poverty, all of his family came up from poverty with him. His parents, his grandmother, his aunts, and cousins all moved to Graceland with him, oftentimes working for Elvis, maintaining the property when he wasn't there, running his fan club, and doing all of the little tasks that he was not available to do. Graceland would become very important to Elvis. That was where he got comfort and solace when he wasn't on the road. This is also where he got peace and quiet to read and downtime from his grueling filming schedule. Elvis struggled with cystic acne on his neck, face, shoulders, and back, which was largely kept secret for many years. Although he had his acne treated many times during his filming days, he often still was reluctant to be bare-backed or completely topless in any film or photograph. And if he was careful not to show his back as it had many acne scars. Elvis Presley was also prone to getting very large cystic boils, of which he had to get treated by a medical physician. He was once quoted as being the most handsome man that has ever lived. And quote, his face was the most perfect, most symmetrical, most beautiful, handsome face that I have ever seen, and photographs never did him justice, unquote. Yet Elvis was flawed and imperfect, and he knew it. But his early career, it was still very polarizing for Elvis, because as he would perform and play the part on stage, he saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of beautiful young girls clawing for a chance to touch him, to hug him, to kiss him. And that had to have played on his ego in some kind of capacity, although deeply inside, he was insecure. After purchasing Graceland, he had to surround the property with tall barbed wire fencing, and that's when the iron gates in the front were put in, because so many hundreds of fans would come to his house and to the fence, of which still to this day you can see hundreds of thousands of names that are engraved in the brick walling that created the fence. Even in his sanctuary, Elvis still was not far from the reach of screaming women and girls, clamoring to get a glimpse of him or to get an autograph or photo with him. At this time, he's also being introduced to hundreds of Hollywood starlets that were up and coming in the acting community of Los Angeles, Hollywood. Although Elvis himself was not exempt from the pressures of filming and Hollywood, he had already been introduced to prescription medications as a way to lose weight or to control his weight years prior in 1954 when he was only 19 years old. Early in his career, Elvis once put himself in an unintentional coma. He was not eating any food. He was smoking up to 80 cigarettes a day. That's 4 packs of cigarettes, as well as taking diet pills. He had to be hospitalized for 3 days. At this point in his life, Elvis was already introduced to Dexedrine, which he was misusing to keep himself awake during long filming and recording session days. He was also given Percodan while he was in the hospital for his coma. Colonel Parker would keep Elvis's agenda very tightly controlled and full to the brim, especially in his early years when he was young and energetic. Elvis's schedule very quickly became overwhelming to him, and he had to find new ways to cope. Elvis was still performing very often in many different states. While on tour, Elvis wasn't keeping his business clean. He cared more about exploiting the admiration of particularly underage young girls than he did almost anything else. And this is also where his predatory behavior started to really show. There is much debate said about this behavior and if this was just a part of his PR marketing when he was on tour to make himself a bachelor, young, eligible, to make sure that he was able to connect one-on-one with many of his female fans so that they get the chance to feel like they know him personally, to touch them, to hug them, to kiss them. And Elvis was very much known for inappropriately grabbing and kissing his fans, all the way up into his very last performance. He would oftentimes take women who were there at his concerts with their husbands by the face and kiss them with tongue right in front of their husbands. And because he was Elvis, the husbands allowed it. That would become a repetitive thing, that it was, quote, okay, because it was Elvis, exclamation point, unquote. Devil in disguise or hound dog. Elvis was a hound dog, and he was not no friend of ours. He loved to be loved, but he didn't love to love in return. In this chapter, we're going to dive into the grubby and gritty truth of Elvis Presley and his personal relationships, specifically to young 14-year-old girls. Completely hidden until now was Elvis's infatuation with very young children females, particularly of age 14. Frances Forbes was only 14 years old when she started dating Elvis. They dated for 2 years. He called her, quote, Little Frances, unquote. Frances states, quote, he was my first love, my first kiss, my first everything. It was not sexual, but we would neck, kiss, and carry on, unquote. She continues on by stating, quote, I knew I was only one of many who shared Elvis. I understood because he was Elvis, unquote. Frances also stated how she often missed school over a 2-year period and how it affected her grades and attendance, to the point where her parents were getting extremely upset because of her missing school. Elvis would, quote, speak to her parents, soothing her mother's feathers often, unquote. Yet her mother and father would still allow her to spend time at Graceland, which affected her ability to be successful in her academics. Frances Forbes would also say, quote, we always knew about Priscilla despite their attempts to keep her hidden and out of sight until legal appropriate age, unquote. In 1960, when Elvis was 25 years old, he was filming in Los Angeles, where he saw a photo of 14-year-old Sandy Farrah at her father's nightclub. He asked her father if he could meet her. She was only 14 years old. And then he goes on to ask her father if he can date her. Her mother said absolutely not. And so Elvis had a remedy that the mother would be able to come on all the dates and chaperone her, to which she agreed. Sandy Farrah says, quote, there was a lot of hugging and kissing. Even though Elvis would really close shave, we would kiss for 4 hours at a time, and I would be raw and red-faced the next day at school because of his stubble rubbing on my cheek so hard. After only 4 days of being chaperoned, her parents agreed to allow her to go on a date with Elvis unchaperoned, to which they did a lot of dry touching. She said they did everything but sexual. They would laugh, talk, watch TV, eat pizza, ice cream, and kiss. Sandy Farrah was then asked by Elvis to be his girlfriend and to move from Los Angeles, California to Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee. And this was not long before Priscilla had moved to Graceland. It is said that Sandy Farrah was his first original choice. Her parents denied her moving to Graceland to be with Elvis, but she continued to play extras in many of his hit films for several more years after they dated. Sandy Farrah stated, quote, at that time, the age gap was not that unusual. Many 14-year-olds dated men that were in their 20s, and it was accepted socially, unquote. She also states, quote, Elvis was very shy, vulnerable, and he opened up to me in ways that he didn't seem to open up with others in his life, unquote. Despite Elvis's many attempts to get Sarah Farrah's parents to agree, her mother said, quote, over my dead body is my daughter moving to Graceland, unquote. In 1974, 14-year-old Risa Gosson was hanging out with Elvis's 3 stepbrothers, which would become Vernon's second wife, 3 sons from her previous marriage, when Elvis showed up at their house and swept her off her feet, taking her on a lavish shopping trip and showing her around the grounds of Graceland. On that first trip, she says, quote, Elvis took me shopping, buying me whatever I wanted, clothes, bikinis, lingeries, and a beautiful studded 70s style leather jacket, to which she still has to this day, unquote. Risa says, quote, I was only a baby at 14 years old, unquote. In that lavish shopping trip, Elvis dropped over $2,700 on clothes, and he would close down entire stores just to impress her, where they had the entire shop alone. They would often spend many days at Graceland alone. She says, quote, I didn't expect much from him, and it didn't take much to reel me in with the initial shopping trips, because to impress a 14-year-old is easy. I was easy to please, unquote. She says that Elvis said, quote, it took him back to his younger years, unquote. Risa Gossin goes on to say, quote, we were kissing only. He would stop just before sex, leaving me hanging, and he would deny me any further, unquote. Risa goes on to say, quote, nothing inappropriate ever happened between us, unquote, and, quote, it didn't ever occur to me that there was anything inappropriate going on, unquote. They had dated for over 6 months. Risa, too, would go on to say, quote, age gaps were not unusual at that time, unquote. Risa would also include, quote, that we knew he had other people he was likely dating, and it was just unspoken but understood, quote. She also ends with, quote, I loved him very much, and I believed he loved me too, unquote. Frances Forbes, Risa Gossin, and Sandy Farah all share one thing, as Sandy Farah said, quote, there was no such thing as pedophilia in those days. I've never even heard of a word or any word like that back then, unquote. These young girls, now elderly women, all share one thing in common, and that is their strong denial that anything was inappropriate back then, and that was a commonplace occurrence. When all 3 women were independently asked if this behavior was predatory, they all shared the common denial of no, that it was not alarming, it was not uncommon, and in fact, they all strongly defend Elvis. The sentimental feelings he left with each of these women are still strong to this day, which really shows just how much of an influence he was on them all.
You're a little old for the teenagers now?
That's the first time I've been asked that one. I don't know. I don't feel too old. I can still move around pretty good.
Even nearly 5 decades after Elvis Presley passed away, the internet is still seeing things like this. Elvis asked out my great aunt on the right, but my grandma said no because guys like that only wanted to sleep with girls. This was sometime in the late 50s, early 60s. Now, this is when Elvis's career was well established, and so was his fame. In his book, Elvis Presley, A Southern Life, Joel Williamson writes about Elvis's life on the road, quote, Elvis preyed on a group of 3 14-year-olds who would pillow fight, wrestle, tickle him, and kiss Elvis, who was then 22 at the time. He all but went all the way, denying the girls more and leaving them unfulfilled, unquote. Williamson also says, quote, an incident in which Elvis slept with a fan of 15 years old in Louisiana, performing weekly on the show Louisiana Hayride in 1954. A condom broke during the intimate act. Elvis then sought advice from his friend musicians on the road with him and ended up taking the girl to a local emergency room to hopefully get a DOUCHE done and medical care to prevent any possible pregnancy. All the while obsessively calling his 15-year-old girlfriend Dixie Locke, whom he also liked to dress like his own personal living doll, unquote. Priscilla Presley biographer author Susan Finstead stated that, quote, Elvis would regularly say, 14 will get you 20. He knew and was fully aware that it was illegal and against the law, unquote. Sarah Forbes says, quote, I wouldn't like my daughter today. No. 14 with a 26-year-old man at his house alone? No, absolutely not. But then again, he wasn't Elvis, unquote. Risa Gossin continues, quote, he never wanted to get married or have kids. He would have been content as it was. He worked too much most of his life. He didn't have time to give to a wife or any children. He was forced to marry Priscilla by Colonel Parker because she had been living with him since 17 and the press knew about her. Her father also gave consent for her to move under Elvis's promise that he would marry her, unquote. Sandy Farah would say, quote, by today's standards, yes, these are unthinkable, these relationships, unquote. Author Susan Finstead would go on to say, quote, he was frozen at an elementary level because he became so famous so fast when he was so young. He suffered some kind of emotional arrested development, unquote. She also adds that until he reached 40 years of age, quote, he never stopped, unquote. Burning love. December 20th of 1957, Elvis Presley was drafted. March 24th of 1958, he goes on to enlist into the U.S. Army because of his draft note. He spent 6 months in Fort Hood, Texas, doing his basic training. Although he only served 2 years, his manager, Colonel Parker, took this opportunity to make Elvis look like a patriot, a good boy, one that was just like everybody else and not a famed star who was too good to risk his lives like other young men of his time. This is where Elvis's life took a turn for the worse. On August 14th of 1958, his mother, Gladys Presley, passes away suddenly after being hospitalized with acute hepatitis and severe chronic liver disease, which stemmed from her alcohol use to cope with her separation from her one and only living child. Elvis had just been stationed in Germany. Shortly after his mother Gladys passed away, Elvis would go on to meet a 14-year-old girl named Priscilla Beaulieu at a party in Bad Nauheim, Germany, September 13th of 1959. Curry Grant, an Air Force friend of Elvis's, was the one who made the introduction when he seen Priscilla and her brother hanging out at the Eagles Club. The Eagles Club is where American soldiers, their children, and friends would socialize while stationed in Germany. He approached her, asking, do you like Elvis? Grant told Priscilla that he was a very close friend of Elvis's and invited her to his home. Priscilla's stepfather would check the credentials of Curry Grant before giving permission for her to go, as her real father passed away when she was only 6 months old from a plane accident. Priscilla's biological father was U.S. Navy pilot James Frederick Wagner, who died in an airplane crash. That is when her stepfather, Joseph Paul Beaulieu, adopted her a few months after her real father passed away, and he married her mother. For all legal intents and purposes, he was her dad. Of her first meeting with Elvis, Priscilla said, quote, Elvis was insecure, vulnerable. In their second meeting, they went to a bedroom where all they did was spend 4 hours talking. She said he was lonely, isolated, and needed a friend, and I just happened to understand and listen, unquote. Elvis told Priscilla, quote, "You resemble my mother in a spiritual sense," unquote. And since he had just recently lost his mother, his very beloved mother, that made his connection and pull to Priscilla that much greater. Priscilla was quiet, shy, reserved, and obedient. She was also a virgin and untouched by any man. She says this is what drew Elvis to her. Although at home, Priscilla was anything but. She started missing school, refusing to go to school, refusing to listen to her mother and stepfather, and refused to obey them if they didn't allow her to see Elvis. So they reluctantly agreed to allow her to continue to date him. Author Susan Finstead wrote the first biography on Priscilla over 21 years ago. She states, quote, "When writing the biography, Priscilla told me that Elvis had confided in her, that he felt immense pressure to perform in the bedroom. Elvis, the king, the sex symbol. He felt more comfortable, in control, and authoritative if with an inexperienced girl because they didn't know any different. His sweet spot was always a 14-year-old little girl," unquote. Susan Finstead stated, quote, "I didn't know Priscilla was the only teenage girl. He had a proclivity for teenage girls, particularly 14 years old. There was a long line of them," unquote. Priscilla immediately became acclimated with the notoriety and attention that she received simply by being next to Elvis Presley. And despite his philandering affairs and flamboyant, promiscuous relationships with multiple teenage girls, sometimes as many as 5 to 7 at any given time, Priscilla continued to date him anyway. On March 15th of 1960, Elvis Presley was done with his active duty in the United States of America Army. He was free to go home, but not soon enough, he asked Priscilla to move to Graceland with him. She was 16 at this time, and she begged her mother and stepfather to allow her to move to Memphis, Tennessee. Elvis and his father Vernon both promised Joseph Beaulieu that he would not only take care of Priscilla, but that she would never be alone, as Elvis's grandmother, aunts, cousins, and his father and stepmother were all nearby. Elvis promised that he would provide for Priscilla, that she would finish high school, graduate, and that he would marry her. Priscilla begged her parents to allow her to move to Graceland when they reluctantly agreed to allow her to do so. In May of 1963, she was 17 years old. She originally moved in with Elvis's father, Vernon, and his new wife, Dee Presley, and their 3 kids across the street from Graceland in their home. She slowly started moving her belongings into Graceland without permission from Vernon or her parents. She only had 8 weeks left of high school, and she transferred to Immaculate Conception High School in Memphis for those final weeks when she then graduated. She stated that, quote, "Elvis would give her Dexedrine to help her stay awake throughout the day," unquote. Colonel Parker then reminded Elvis, after 4 years of Priscilla living at Graceland, that he promised to marry her, and so he did. On May 1st of 1967, at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, Priscilla was 21 and Elvis was 32, and they wed. Exactly 9 months later, on February 1st of 1968, Lisa Marie Presley, their one and only child together, would be born. This would also be Elvis's only child that he would ever have for the remainder of his life. The night they got married is the night that he impregnated Priscilla, because Lisa Marie was born exactly 9 months later. From here to the great unknown, Lisa Marie Presley and her oldest daughter Riley Keough's memoir that was done after Lisa Marie passed away, Lisa Marie says this, quote, "I've been told that mine was a sweet birth story. My dad was very, very nervous. Everyone was. They had lots of dress rehearsals, trying to find the quickest route to the hospital. They had done a few test runs and everything was fine. Then Jerry Schilling, one of my dad's oldest friends, who was driving, almost went to the wrong hospital. Then I was born. My mom wanted to look good for my dad, so she decided to put on false eyelashes before he came in to see us. But she was still so out of it from the medication, she glued them onto the mirror instead of on her own eyelids. After that, there was a press conference. My mom and dad walked out of the hospital, did their wave. Everyone was taking pictures, so the press was always there right out of the gate from the very day I was born. Then they took me home to Graceland." Unquote. In her 2024 memoir, post her passing, Lisa Marie Presley is quoted saying, "Going to his shows was my favorite thing in the world. I was so proud of him. He would take me by the hand and bring me on stage, then get walked to wherever his place was on the stage, and then I would be taken from him and brought to wherever I was going to be sitting in the audience, usually with Vernon. The electricity of those shows. There's nothing I felt that could have been close to that feeling ever. Electrifying is such a generic word, but it's really what it felt like. I loved watching him perform. I had certain songs that I like Hurt and How Great Thou Art. I would ask him to sing those songs for me, and he would always say yes." Lisa Marie was the apple of her father's eye, the same way that Elvis was the apple of his mother Gladys's eye. They shared the same secret baby language with each other that Elvis and Gladys once had, and Elvis would never say no to Lisa Marie. He spoiled her, but he loved her immensely, his one and only child. Don't be cruel. In 1964, Elvis would go on to meet Anne Margaret when they were filming Viva Las Vegas. Even though Elvis, between the years of 1956 and 1969, completed 31 full-length feature films, Viva Las Vegas was one of his most popular, and so was his co-star, Hollywood starlet Anne Margaret. Even though he was married to Priscilla Presley, Elvis had a very long, very tumultuous, deeply affectionate love affair with Anne Margaret. It was said that he really wanted to marry her, and eventually the press got wind of their off-screen romance. And Priscilla was not happy about this, as she was staying at home playing wife, homemaker, and mother to his child, Lisa Marie. After Priscilla gave birth to Lisa Marie in 1968, Elvis stopped being intimate with Priscilla. Priscilla says, quote, "He mentioned to me before we were married that he had never been able to make love to a woman who had given birth to a child before," unquote. It's unknown if this is because of what childbirth does to a woman's physical looks or her private region. In 1969, Elvis introduced Priscilla to Mike Stone, who was his martial arts and karate instructor. He hired Stone to train Priscilla. She stated, quote, "Stone gave me freedom to be myself and newfound confidence to find my identity, which I had never been able to have," unquote. Mike Stone divorced his wife in 1968, leaving her for Priscilla. They went on to have an almost 4-year-long love affair, despite her being married to Elvis Presley. After Priscilla had her own affair and learned that Elvis had an affair with Aunt Margaret and was deeply in love with her, she decided in 1972 to confess to Elvis that she had been carrying on a 4-year affair, and not with anybody, with Mike Stone, their karate instructor, and his friend, who he introduced to her and had hired to train Priscilla. Elvis was so angry he went ballistic. Priscilla said, quote, "He forced me onto the bed and forcefully made love to me. He said to me, 'This is how a real man makes love to a woman,'" unquote. He was so out of his mind with anger, he even told his bodyguard to take Stone's life and contemplated hiring him, stopping short of paying him and planning an actual date. He was paranoid and convinced that Mike Stone had hired men to come after him and to hurt him or attempt on his life. Until his passing on August 16th of 1977, Elvis continued to run as many as 5 to 7 relationships at a time, often with many underage young girls and famous Hollywood starlets. In 1973, he and Priscilla officially divorced. This is when Elvis started really turning to food and prescription medications for comfort to cope. Elvis was known to eat to extreme excess. He loved hearty, tasty, fried, deep fried, and refried dishes, such as meatloafs, fried foods, yogurts, sodas, corned beef hash, fried potato sandwiches, ice cream, fried peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, meatballs wrapped in bacon. He also had a deep love for breakfast foods, especially bacon. He would eat sausage, bacon, eggs, baked rolls, coffee, fried potatoes every morning. Elvis also loved the Fool's Gold loaf. It's an entire loaf of Italian bread, hollowed out, with butter all over it, an entire jar of peanut butter, an entire jar of jam, and 1 pound of fried bacon served inside, deep fried, and then cut and served. What Elvis didn't know was that he also suffered from hypertension, megacolon, and cytochrome defects. A DNA analysis after his passing showed that he had a gene mutation which causes hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Members of the Presley family and on Gladys's side of the family both suffered from genetic congenitive heart disease, which is still the #1 natural cause of death among humans worldwide. It was no secret to Elvis's inner circle that he was in a bad way. He was either sleeping, impaired, or unable to function. But one thing still persisted when Elvis reached the age of 40, and that was his love of very young girls. My way. Even though Elvis used prescription medications as early as 1954, they would eventually play a role in his untimely death, his cardiac arrhythmia, and cardiac arrest. By the 70s and reaching 40 years of age, Elvis had already been a longtime user of opiate prescription medications, which oftentimes causes severe constipation, as a bad diet added that strain to his heart. At the heaviest, Elvis weighed 350 pounds. The day before Elvis would pass away on August 16th of 77, his personal physician and friend, George Nicolopoulos, gave him this prescription. Elvis' personal physician and friend, George Nicolopoulos, or Dr. Nick, was at Elvis's beck and call for nearly a decade. He began treating the king for saddle pain in 1967, and all too soon, Elvis turned into a opiate dependent. Dr. Nick admitted at a hearing before the Tennessee Board of Health that he had prescribed Elvis thousands and thousands of prescriptions for very addictive medications. He also claims that he slipped hundreds of sugar pills, aka placebos, to try and curb Elvis's dependency on these medications. Elvis also misused antihistamines, tranquilizers, barbiturates, quaaludes, sleep medications, hormones, opiate pain medications, laxatives, and injections. Dr. Nick would pass away in February of 2016 at the age of 88. However, he lost his medical license in 1995 for overprescribing prescription to his patients. After Elvis Presley passed in 1977, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners charged Nicolopoulos with overprescribing controlled substances. He was acquitted of the charges, but his license was suspended in 1980. He maintained a private practice until 1995, when his medical license was then revoked. He applied to get it back twice and was denied. Elvis's longtime bodyguard, Red West, said, quote, "His usage increased from 1960 to 1977, so much so that he stopped bathing," unquote. Red West was also quoted saying, "Elvis's use started early on, and you can see the effects early in his career. In one movie, Love Me Tender, debuted in 1956, he had been already dependent and misusing medications during filming in 1955. He said it only began here and escalated to dependency and chronic misuse," unquote. President Richard Nixon awarded Elvis Presley a special badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. How would that look had he passed of an overdose? In 2023, Elvis's second cousin, Democrat Brandon Presley, had hopes to become the governor of Mississippi. Elvis's first cousin, Harold Ray Presley, was elected sheriff in Lee County, Mississippi from 1993 to 2001 when he lost his life due to a out with an alleged active kidnapper. He was instrumental in pulling over $30 million off of controlled substances and narcotics off of the streets single-handedly during his tenure in law enforcement. Elvis was known to have a deep love and obsession with badges and had a very extensive collection of deputy and sheriff's badges during his lifetime. In 1959, 1 year after Gladys passed away, Vernon Presley met Devada D. Stanley, who then left her husband for him. Her husband was stationed in Germany with Elvis, and they had 3 boys together. Vernon and Dee would go on to get married on July 3rd of 1960, of which Elvis did not approve, nor did he attend. They got married on July 3rd of 1960 in Huntsville, Alabama. Vernon and Dee separated in 1974 and divorced officially in 1977, shortly after Elvis would pass away. Vernon Presley goes on to pass away in 1979 from cardiac arrest at only 63 years old. He is buried at the Meditation Garden in Graceland with Gladys Presley. His mother, Minnie Mae, would not pass until a year later in 1980. All shook up. Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced deceased at 3:30 p.m. on August 16th of 1977 at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. He was only 42 years old. He had been transported to the hospital by fire department ambulance after his longtime girlfriend and fiancée, Ginger Alden, found him deceased on the floor of his private upstairs bathroom. He had told her that he was going to use the bathroom and read. After he did not come back, she decided to go check on him, and that is when she found him unresponsive. 2 days later, on August 18th of 1977, Elvis Presley was laid in his home at Graceland for his funeral and viewing. One of the first attendants was his greatest love and friend, Anne Margaret, the woman who truly held the key to Elvis's heart, the one that he wanted to marry. Lisa Marie would say in her 2024 memoir entitled From Here to the Great Unknown, quote, "The viewing was scheduled to be a public event. My dad was brought to the home. They kept him in the living room, the room before the piano room on the right when you walk in the front door. I felt so happy because he was there. I felt lucky. I was so busy looking at everyone else's grief that I couldn't actually have mine yet. I was trying to grieve my dad, but at the same time, I understood that he was Elvis Presley. I understood at 9 years old his persona and that being Elvis was what he loved doing the most," unquote. I knew that soon he wasn't going to be here anymore. I don't remember much after that. I was only 9. It was all so effing beyond me. It'll still hit me on and off. It comes. There have been nights as an adult when I would just get completely drunk and listen to his music and sit there and cry. The grief still comes. It's still just there. Lisa Marie goes on to say, "Then I had another thought about not being able to ever come back here anymore. My grandfather, Vernon, was still alive, so maybe I would have an excuse to come back, but would my mom let me?" unquote. Lisa would also say, quote, "I wanted my other life back. I always wanted to go to Memphis. I wanted to make sure that I could go to Memphis, and that's what she used sometimes to threaten me, that I wouldn't be able to go back to Memphis if I didn't ... unquote. Any place is paradise. Elvis's then ex-wife Priscilla Presley was instrumental in getting the investors to open up Graceland into a tourist hotspot and hub in Memphis, Tennessee, also opening up 2 of his airplanes as a museum and a whole museum and soundstage across the street from Graceland House. She preserved the upstairs and kept it off limits to the public still to this day. Lisa Marie said that was instrumental in helping her grieve, even when she was a mother herself. Lisa said, quote, "My father had a whole stack of books like a nightstand next to his bed. He had the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, and all kinds of religious texts like Gnostic Gospels. He was clearly searching for something. The same thing that I'm searching for," unquote. In 2025, Graceland is still the second most visited home in the United States, topped only by the White House, according to the U.S. Interior Department, which granted Graceland landmark status. American culture and music changed irreversibly because of Elvis. It would be difficult to tell the story of the 20th century without discussing his many contributions made by this legendary, iconic artist. Professor Bertrand postulated that Presley's rock and roll music brought an unprecedented access to African American culture that challenged the 1950s segregated generation to reassess ingrained segregationist stereotypes. His legacy endures, resonating even today. Presley stormed into the 1950s music world, transforming popular music by infusing rockabilly, rhythm and blues, and country. His stage presence and dynamic shows took the world by storm, forging an unwavering fan following, still in 2025. Whatever reservations one may have about Elvis Presley, his estate still, almost 5 decades later, largely employs African Americans by over 91%. His career was just shy of 24 years from 1954 to 1977. Even in death and legacy, he has given back to the African American culture, music culture, and the community of Memphis, Tennessee. One could possibly argue that even in death, he has given back twice as much as he may have ever appropriated during his career and life. Elvis still holds top awards and accolades in music today. Towards the end of the 20th century, Elvis Presley was named as the Entertainer of the Century by TV Guide and other publications. The Recording Industry Association of America also named him the top-selling male rock artist of the century. The only other person that has ever came close to this was Michael Jackson. Both Elvis and Michael Jackson's estates posthumously can garner anywhere from $120 to $200 million annually. Bonus fun facts. Elvis failed music class all throughout school. He could not read or write music, but he played by ear. Elvis was a natural blonde, and he dyed his hair and his eyebrows black his entire 24-year career. He was a karate expert. He had a 7th degree black belt. He once inhaled a tooth cap into his lung while filming Jailhouse Rock in 1957, where he had to go have an emergency surgery to help remove it. He had a pet chimpanzee named Scatter. He ate over 10 pounds of peanut butter and over 10 bunches of bananas weekly. He served in the U.S. Army, but he received good conduct medals as well as medals for expert marksmanship. He was also a sergeant. He never wrote any songs at all, but he did have a say in which ones he was going to perform and sing, however. He never performed outside of North America. He did 5 shows in Canada in 1957 and 1 unofficial performance in Paris, France. He had a library card, and he loved to read. In Tupelo, Mississippi, a librarian had found a card that he had in 1948. They found it and sold it in 2014 at auction for over $8,000. In 24 years, Elvis released over 57 albums. He also filmed 31 full-length feature films and 2 concert film documentaries. Music and movies are not Elvis Presley's biggest accomplishment. His legend begins with his family. Despite his only daughter, Lisa Marie, being married 4 times, 2 of her marriages produced Elvis's grandchildren. In order, daughter Riley Keough, only son Benjamin Keough, and her fraternal twin daughters, Harper and Finley Lockwood. Ben Keough sadly took his own life on July 12th of 2020 at only 27 years old. He is buried at the Meditation Garden at Graceland. On January 12th of 2023, Lisa Marie Presley passes away suddenly from complications due to a former bariatric surgery. She was only 54. Lisa Marie Presley and her son Benjamin shared a common mental health and substance misuse issues, as Elvis did himself. Riley Keough, 35, is now the sole trustee of Graceland Estate. She oversees Harper and Finley's equal share of the estate until they become of age. Harper and Finley will be 17 in October of 2025. January 8th of 2025, Elvis would have celebrated his 90th birthday, and Graceland threw their annual birthday celebration for the icon. Every year, Elvis fans from around the globe flock to the gates of Graceland, and they even get to share the annual birthday celebration cake. Music was not the only legacy that Elvis Presley left behind. He left behind his bloodline, the future generation, and a time capsule in his estate, Graceland. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for watching. I am so grateful that you are here. I am Barbara Ann, and this is my channel, Straight Out of Context. If you enjoyed, don't forget to subscribe, like, turn on notifications, and share.